October 17th, 1943, Camp Aliceville, Alabama, 2:47 a.m. A German prisoner, little more than a bundle of bones under a worn uniform, steadied a metal mess kit that rattled against his fingers. The food inside seemed almost unreal to him. After 3 years with the Africa Corps, his diet had consisted mostly of coarse bread bulked with filler and a bitter ersatz drink that only resembled coffee in color. Now, weighing barely 128 pounds, he confronted a plate crowded with scrambled eggs, strips of bacon, soft white bread spread with real butter, and a mug of sweetened coffee rich with cream, an abundance he had not encountered since before the war. Years later, one former POW summarized the transformation starkly. At the moment of my capture, I was down to 128 pounds. After 2 years in an American camp, I reached 185 pounds. I'd gotten so heavy that my eyes seemed to disappear into my face. His experience was far from unusual. Thousands of German prisoners gained comparable weight in U.S. camps during the Second World War, a trend documented in camp records, medical inspections, and Red Cross reports. While German soldiers still fighting on the Eastern Front were reduced to eating whatever frozen or stringy meat they could obtain, and those on the Western Front survived on drastically reduced supplies, the prisoners held in the United States consumed meals equivalent to those issued to American garrison troops, an explicit requirement of the 1929 Geneva Convention. More than 425,000 German POWs would eventually be detained across the United States. Their daily lives inside these camps gave them direct exposure to levels of food security, material comfort, and administrative organization that contrasted sharply with what they had known under the collapsing German war economy. For many, this confrontation with American abundance would alter not only their physical condition, but also their assumptions about U.S. society, industrial strength, and democratic governance. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces capitulated in Tunisia in May 1943, American medical teams were confronted with an exhausted and nutritionally broken army. Months of tenuous supply lines, constant movement, and desert conditions had made many soldiers to emaciated figures. What had once been regarded as an elite formation of the Wehrmacht now exhibited clear signs of widespread physical deterioration. The official German field ration, known as the Verpflegungssatz, was designed to provide ample calories for troops in combat. By the winter of 1942, the reality bore little resemblance to the regulation. Bread was frequently stale or replaced with hardtack infested with insects. Breakfast usually consisted of acorn-based coffee substitutes sweetened with saccharin. The midday meal often amounted to a small tin of processed meat, typically horse or mule, stretched with cellulose or sawdust-like fillers. Supper brought dehydrated vegetable mixtures, which swelled when cooked, but delivered minimal nutrients. Dr. James Patterson of the U.S. Army Medical Corps conducted systematic examinations of captured troops at the processing facility near Oran in May 1943. His findings described extensive malnutrition, cases of scurvy, night blindness caused by vitamin A deficiency, swelling linked to protein deprivation, and other ailments consistent with prolonged undernourishment. Recovery for many prisoners began even before they reached American soil. Liberty ships, produced in remarkable numbers by U.S. shipyards, carried as many as 30,000 prisoners per month across the Atlantic. Their first meal aboard these transports often exceeded the caloric value of an entire week's rations in North Africa. Beef stew with potatoes, fresh bread, butter, and coffee with milk formed a standard offering. The sudden richness overwhelmed stomachs accustomed to near starvation, and numerous prisoners became ill simply because their digestive systems could not handle the abrupt change in diet. American officers were frequently startled by the condition of the men boarding the transports. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Matthews recalled watching long lines of German prisoners struggle up gangplanks, faces hollow, ribs visible through uniforms, some so weak they required physical support to keep moving. He later noted that medical personnel had to reintroduce normal food gradually to avoid dangerous metabolic reactions in severely malnourished bodies. the United States treated POW nutrition as both a humanitarian requirement and a strategic imperative. Article 11 of the 1929 Geneva Convention mandated that prisoners receive the same quantity and quality of food as depot troops. In a memorandum dated September 1943, Colonel Edward Davidson emphasized the policy's reciprocal value, writing that each well-fed German prisoner constituted a form of insurance for American servicemen held in Axis camps. Administration of the POW program fell under the Office of the Provost Marshal General, which oversaw an enormous bureaucratic structure. Detailed records tracked caloric intake, weekly menu plans, health assessments, and weight fluctuations. Camps submitted reports twice a month, Swiss inspectors conducted regular evaluations, and the Red Cross monitored compliance. The scale of documentation, thousands of pages produced annually, reflected both American logistical capacity and the political importance assigned to adherence to international law. The standard ration issued in U.S.-run prisoner-of-war camps guaranteed every German internee a generous and predictable supply of food each day. These allocations included sizable servings of meat, bread, potatoes, dairy products such as cheese, butter, and milk, along with limitless quantities of genuine coffee rather than the ersatz substitutes common in wartime Europe. Fresh fruits and vegetables were incorporated as routine staples. Altogether, the daily caloric value usually fell somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 calories, with opportunities for prisoners to supplement their diets through commissary purchases. German POWs were able to acquire a range of comfort goods: cigarettes, chocolate, beer, wine, soft drinks, even ice cream, using special camp currency obtained through approved labor or distributed in accordance with Geneva Convention allowances. Maintaining this extensive food program required an enormous logistical system. Quartermaster units submitted daily requisitions for thousands of meals, coordinated shipments from regional suppliers, oversaw refrigerated storage, and supervised kitchens that operated without interruption. The scale of organization surpassed anything the German military had ever attempted, resulting in captured soldiers being fed more consistently and often more abundantly than the active combat troops of their own army. One of the most thoroughly documented examples comes from a former prisoner who recalled gaining 57 pounds, or 26 kilograms, over 2 years in American custody. He reported entering captivity at 128 pounds and leaving at 185 pounds, noting humorously that by the end he had grown so stout that my eyes nearly disappeared in my face. This man was Georg Gärtner, a sergeant captured in Tunisia in 1943, who later became known as Hitler's last soldier in America after escaping from Camp Deming, New Mexico in late 1945. Living for 4 decades under the assumed identity Dennis W. Giles, he ultimately surrendered in 1985. In the memoir he produced with historian Arnold Cromer, Gärtner emphasized the astonishment many prisoners felt at their treatment, remarking that the abundance of food, reliability of meals, and general comfort far exceeded anything then available to civilians in Germany. A similar impression was recorded by military chaplain Alex Funker, interned at Camp Algona, Iowa. He wrote that virtually all prisoners were struck by the fairness and generosity of American procedures, and that many of them left captivity with unexpectedly positive attitudes toward the United States. After the war, Funker examined medical and administrative records, which confirmed the widespread weight gains he had observed firsthand, often between 40 and 60 pounds per man. The physical transformations were so striking that reintegration officers frequently noted families failing to recognize their returning relatives. Captain William Burke, who oversaw the processing of repatriated POWs in 1946, described the returnees as looking more like well-trained athletes or prosperous businessmen than former combatants. Families braced for emaciated survivors were instead met by men who appeared robust and well-nourished. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, roughly 4,000 prisoners were housed across more than 600 acres containing hundreds of structures. The camp developed a large academic program that offered several hundred courses, created in cooperation with nearby universities. Its numerous kitchens served thousands of meals per day and were equipped with electric stoves, walk-in coolers, industrial mixers, and mechanical dishwashers, technologies unfamiliar to many German soldiers. Constructed in just 90 days, the facility showcased American engineering capacity. Electric lighting in all buildings, centralized heating, flush toilets, and hot water systems. For prisoners from rural districts of Germany, accustomed to outhouses and oil lamps, such amenities were extraordinary. In Texas, Camp Hearn gained the local nickname the Fritz Ritz. At its peak, it held about 5,000 prisoners who created elaborate recreational areas and organized clubs, theaters, and sports leagues. The camp's centrally operated bakeries produced thousands of loaves of bread each day. Separate mess halls offered food modeled after various regional German cuisines, prepared with American ingredients in an effort to recreate familiar meals absent in wartime Europe. The commanding officer, Colonel Donald Drake, adopted a philosophy he called calories for cooperation. Prisoners who followed regulations were granted extra rations, upgraded meals, and expanded access to the commissary. His reports indicated that under this system, disciplinary issues remained rare, while weight gains averaged around 45 pounds per prisoner over an 18-month period. Camp Aliceville, Alabama, became known for its systematic efforts to rehabilitate soldiers captured during the North African campaigns, many of whom arrived in extremely poor condition. Medical personnel implemented controlled feeding schedules designed to rebuild strength gradually. According to Major Robert Harrison, the camp's chief medical officer, malnutrition symptoms disappeared quickly, vitamin deficiencies were corrected, and long-standing dental and metabolic problems were treated effectively. His post-war medical study documented rapid weight increases during the first 90 days, followed by steady monthly gains of 2 to 3 pounds. The most extreme case involved a man who entered the camp at 109 pounds and left weighing 181 pounds, a remarkable 72-pound transformation.
At Camp Papago Park, Arizona, naval personnel enjoyed unusually light duties because they were not required to work. Their days centered on leisure, movies, reading, gardening, and organized activities. The camp became famous after a December 1944 escape involving 25 U-boat officers who tunneled out with plans to drift down the Salt River to Mexico, only to discover that the riverbed was dry. All escapees were recaptured, several turning themselves in simply because they were unable to find food in the desert. Even the harsh Arizona landscape, they discovered, offered far less sustenance than the meals waiting for them inside the camp kitchens. Public frustration surged during the war years as Americans compared their own restricted diets with the comparatively generous conditions provided to captured German soldiers. Civilian households operated under strict rationing rules, navigating coupon books, point charts, and shortages that governed everything from coffee to shortening. Meanwhile, prisoners of war, bound by the Geneva Convention's requirements, received full military rations that frequently exceeded what many American families could obtain for themselves. The disparity was not merely theoretical, it became a staple of wartime complaints. In 1944, a Kansas mother, Dorothy Mitchell of Topeka, sent a sharply worded letter to her congressman. She noted that her 3 sons were serving overseas while German POWs stationed nearby reportedly consumed steak twice each week. "I haven't had steak since the month after Pearl Harbor," she wrote bitterly, pointing out that her family's entire monthly meat allowance was less than what the prisoners received within a single long weekend. "Explain that to a mother," she demanded. Federal officials responded with arguments centered on reciprocity and international law. Posters reminded the public that the humane treatment of German POWs served as protection for the nearly 90,000 Americans held captive in Europe. Radio commentaries repeated the same logic, ensuring that prisoners in U.S. custody received proper care
increased the likelihood that Germany would observe similar standards. Yet these explanations did little to calm the anger of citizens who watched enemy soldiers enjoying foods they themselves had gone without for years. The situation became even more volatile when German POWs began assisting with labor shortages on American farms. Many worked alongside families who were themselves scraping by under ration restrictions, only to be fed meals surpassing the farmers' own daily allotments. Tension grew most sharply when racial inequities intersected with POW policy. African-American servicemen, some of whom had fought in combat units overseas, witnessed German captives receiving privileges denied to them. One of the most powerful illustrations came from Bert Trimingham, a Black American soldier stationed in Texas. In a widely circulated letter to Yank magazine, he described entering a local restaurant while German prisoners sat at tables and were served without hesitation. Trimingham, wearing his uniform and combat decorations, was told he could only order through the back door. "The enemy can dine here," he observed bitterly, "but I, the one who fights for this country, cannot." His account became emblematic of an enduring moral contradiction. Enemy soldiers enjoying rights and access still withheld from many American citizens.
Even some German POWs expressed discomfort at the racial order they encountered. In several camp publications written and edited by the prisoners themselves, contributors questioned the logic of a system in which men who had served a regime built on racial ideology were treated more favorably than minority citizens of the United States. In an ironic twist, Nazi soldiers found themselves criticizing segregation practices they witnessed firsthand. The POW labor program, despite these controversies, became essential to wartime agricultural production. By 1944, more than 300,000 Germans were employed on American farms, providing a workforce that kept harvests moving and food supplies stable for both the United States and allied nations. The arrangement proved economically advantageous. POW labor generated millions in revenue and simultaneously improved the physical condition of the prisoners, many of whom arrived underweight. Farmers, desperate for reliable help, often tried to ensure that working conditions were favorable. That meant substantial meals, far more substantial than standard civilian fare. At dawn, prisoners heading to the fields might be greeted with plates of eggs, bacon, pancakes, and hot coffee. Midday meals were delivered directly to work sites and included items such as fried chicken, vegetables, mashed potatoes, and fresh pie. Afternoon breaks brought cold drinks and fruit. After the day's labor ended, another full dinner awaited them back at camp. Combined, these meals frequently exceeded 5,000 calories daily, a stark contrast to wartime shortages elsewhere. In the Great Plains, the scale of American mechanized agriculture astonished many of the prisoners. In Nebraska's sugar beet regions, for example, German workers observed machines performing in minutes tasks that had required countless laborers back home. Hans Dietrich, assigned to an area near Scottsbluff, wrote, "One farmer with modern equipment accomplishes the work of an entire German village. The harvesting machines process more in an hour than we could manage in a week of manual labor." Texas farms relied heavily on POW labor during cotton season. Although the work could be brutal under the relentless summer heat, conditions for the prisoners included constant access to water, scheduled rest periods, and extra food for those who exceeded quota. Wilhelm Hartmann, employed near Kaufman, recorded that he'd gained more than 60 pounds during 14 months of agricultural labor. He recalled, "The farmers fed us as if we were prize livestock. One rancher joked that you can't expect decent labor from men who are half-starved. If only our officers had understood the same." In California's Central Valley, German prisoners offered an irony that many later struggled to describe. Those assigned to harvest crews gathered peaches, apricots, citrus, and other crops, often eating fruit straight from the orchards as they worked. Yet they also witnessed a paradox of American abundance. When supply exceeded what markets could absorb, farm owners sometimes ordered entire loads dumped or buried.
Kurt Vogel recalled seeing excavators push heaps of ripe oranges into large pits. He wrote, "The piles were enormous. My family back home lived on turnips, and here I stood watching food destroyed. I pleaded with the farmers to let us send it to Germany." One grower replied simply that transportation and market prices made it impossible. For many prisoners, this spectacle of waste amidst plenty challenged their understanding of the world more profoundly than any political lecture.
The physical condition of German prisoners of war was closely monitored by American medical authorities, who approached the issue with an almost clinical rigor. Major Thomas Richardson, head medical officer for the U.S. Army's 8th Service Command, compiled medical data from roughly 50,000 examinations conducted between 1943 and 1946. His findings would later influence post-war studies on nutrition and recovery after prolonged deprivation. Richardson documented a consistent pattern of rehabilitation. During the first month of adequate feeding, the digestive system struggled to adapt, and prisoners gained very little weight as their bodies relearned how to handle dietary fats and proteins. By the second month, metabolism had stabilized and weight increases accelerated, commonly reaching 8 to 10 pounds. The following months, roughly the 3rd through the 6th, showed steady gains of 3 to 4 pounds each month. After half a year, the pace slowed but continued. Most prisoners eventually added between 40 and 60 pounds in total. Improvements in health closely followed these physical changes. Vitamin deficiencies disappeared within 3 months. Scurvy, which had plagued many prisoners before arrival, resolved entirely. Cases of night blindness vanished. Dental conditions improved most dramatically. More than 400,000 dental procedures were performed on German POWs, ranging from simple extractions to sophisticated bridge work, treatment many had never received in civilian life. Medical personnel inside German-staffed camp hospitals began reporting an unexpected phenomenon: illnesses associated with abundance rather than deprivation. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann at Camp Herne observed diabetes emerging in men who had previously survived on starvation-level rations, and hypertension appearing in individuals who once had dangerously low blood pressure. Even gout resurfaced among those suddenly exposed to richer diets. Hoffmann noted that these conditions of prosperity were startling to encounter in soldiers who had recently been near collapse. Psychological reactions mirrored the physical adjustments. American camp psychiatrists frequently encountered guilt and emotional distress linked to the prisoners' improving health. Captain James Murray identified what he termed prosperity trauma, a form of psychological conflict produced by recovering in comfort while families at home endured hunger and bombing. Some prisoners worried about how their healthier appearance would be interpreted when they eventually returned. Others described a sense of shame when sitting down to full meals, aware that loved ones in Germany faced acute shortages. The holiday season of 1944 exposed this contrast with particularly sharp clarity. While the Battle of the Bulge raged in Europe and German civilians received meager rations, American POW camps prepared lavish Christmas meals. Archival menus from December 24-25, 1944, preserved in military records, list extraordinary holiday spreads. Generous servings of roast turkey, often more than a pound per person, along with glazed ham, mashed potatoes enriched with butter and cream, sweet potato and green bean casseroles, cranberry sauce, fresh rolls, multiple varieties of pie, and even ice cream. Officers were offered eggnog, and all prisoners had access to unlimited coffee and cocoa. Local churches and civic groups contributed voluntarily. The Methodist Women of Hearne, Texas, delivered 2,000 homemade cookies to Camp Hearne. A Lutheran congregation in Concordia donated hand-knitted scarves for every prisoner.
Even American communities coping with wartime rationing routinely set aside food, yarn, or clothing for enemy soldiers, an act of generosity that many POWs found difficult to comprehend.
Feldwebel Richard Sternberg described the dissonance starkly. He wrote that the men sat at the holiday tables unable to reconcile the feast before us with the hunger our families faced. Some prisoners cried quietly, not from gratitude, but from the emotional burden of contrast. How could we refuse kindness from our captors, he asked, while knowing that accepting it felt like a betrayal of those at home? Despite the abundance and humane treatment, attempts to escape were exceedingly rare. Out of approximately 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States, only 2,222 escape efforts were recorded, and nearly all were unsuccessful. Aside from Georg Gardner, whose case became famous, none managed a permanent flight. The overall escape attempt rate, roughly 0.5%, was the lowest among major prisoner populations in modern warfare. The explanation was straightforward. Life inside the camps, with reliable food, safety, and medical care, offered far better prospects than attempting to flee into unfamiliar territory. The famed Papago Park escape later demonstrated how futile such efforts could be, underscoring the reality that, for most prisoners, remaining in camp was safer and more comfortable than freedom itself. The most ambitious escape attempt undertaken by German submariners in the United States involved 25 U-boat officers who labored for months beneath an Arizona camp. Armed with nothing more than improvised tools, mostly spoons taken from the mess hall, they slowly carved a tunnel that eventually stretched nearly 180 feet. To conceal the soil, they persuaded guards to allow the construction of a makeshift volleyball court, using the freshly turned sand as camouflage for the endless stream of dirt. Their goal was to reach the Salt River, build crude rafts, and drift toward Mexico. The plan collapsed at the very moment they emerged from the tunnel. The Salt River, dry for much of the year, offered no waterway to carry them anywhere. Cut off from food and exposed to the desert environment, most of the escapees surrendered within days. Within 3 weeks, all had been located or had turned themselves in, many weakened by hunger and disillusioned. Decades later, the operations leader, Captain Jürgen Wittenberg, spoke about the attempt with striking candor. "We behaved like zealots. The camp offered meals, beds, safety, even recreation. Beyond the fence there was nothing but arid land, hostile patrols, and near-certain capture. We tried to flee a place of comfort into a wasteland. There was no rational justification, only ideological fervor. And ideology does nothing to satisfy an empty stomach." Most prisoners had already reached that conclusion on their own. Even men who briefly entertained escape understood the absurdity of their situation. They had no identification papers, no access to funds, and only rudimentary English marked by heavy accents. They were surrounded by millions of Americans who had been told to report any suspicious foreigner. Traveling undetected across such distances was practically impossible. Moreover, even a successful escape created its own dilemma. They would either face re-entry into German military service or risk starvation as fugitives. Remaining in the camp at least guaranteed survival until the war's end. German prisoners assigned to labor detachments near American industrial centers encountered realities that deeply unsettled their assumptions about the balance of power. Those working in food processing plants, including Campbell soup facilities, observed automated systems that turned out more canned goods in a single hour than entire German factories could manage in a day. In Michigan, near the massive Willow Run plant, POWs watched B-24 Liberator bombers emerge from assembly lines at intervals of just over an hour. To men accustomed to Germany's fragmented and resource-starved production system, these displays of efficiency were almost incomprehensible. One prisoner, an engineer named Otto Lee from Krefeld,
assisted at a steel mill where daily output exceeded 10,000 tons. He later reflected that the realization was transformative. It dawned on us that this conflict was not primarily a contest of soldiers, but of economies. The Americans could afford losses at ratios we could not imagine. They could replace tanks and aircraft faster than we could build them. No amount of tactics or bravery could offset such mathematics. Agriculture delivered a similar shock. POWs assigned to rural labor witnessed farms that produced roughly twice the yield per acre compared to what they had known in Germany, yet with only a fraction of the manpower. Mechanization allowed a single farmer to manage fields that in Europe would have required entire work crews. Extensive irrigation networks, chemical fertilizers, and hybrid seed varieties generated harvests that seemed almost unnatural to men raised on small-scale or subsistence farming. The magnitude of surplus disturbed many of them. They saw piles of potatoes left to decay due to overproduction, grain burned to stabilize market prices, and milk discarded when commercial demand fell. Franz Müller, a former prisoner, later wrote, "In this country, they can afford to destroy food while people in Europe starve. Only a nation with inexhaustible resources could tolerate such waste." For many, the abundance they witnessed conveyed the essence of American power more vividly than any military formation could. Between late 1945 and 1946, more than 370,000 German POWs were transported back to Europe aboard troop ships. They departed the United States physically transformed, collectively carrying millions of pounds more body weight than when they had arrived. As these well-fed, visibly healthier men stepped onto the docks of a devastated homeland, the contrast was often heartbreaking.
The Germany they returned to was scarred by bombing, racked by hunger, and strained by social upheaval. Many families resented the returning prisoners' relatively robust appearance, viewing them as men who had lived in comparative comfort while civilians at home endured privation. The healthy faces and fuller bodies of the former POWs sometimes made them targets of suspicion or bitterness, marking them as individuals who had somehow escaped the full suffering of the war, even though they too were products of the same catastrophe. For many German families, the return of former prisoners of war brought an unexpected shock. Instead of emaciated men, they greeted relatives who had gained significant weight during captivity, an outcome nearly incomprehensible in a country where civilians faced chronic malnutrition. The contrast bred resentment in some communities. Amidst widespread deprivation, the apparent health and robustness of the returnees seemed almost surreal. Yet the transformation proved temporary. Within months, the weight accumulated in American camps melted away with alarming speed. Surveys conducted by the Allied military government documented dramatic physical decline among repatriated POWs. Typical losses ranged from 30 to 50 pounds within the first half year back home. Bodies that had adjusted to stable, nutrient-rich American diets struggled to function on Germany's meager post-war rations, often barely 1,550 calories a day, and frequently far less. The nutritional collapse aged many men visibly, leaving them looking older in 1946 than when they had been taken prisoner years earlier. One such case was Heinrich Huber, who had been captured weighing 134 pounds and left U.S. captivity at 186 pounds. Only 6 months after returning to Hamburg, his weight had fallen to 138 pounds. Huber later explained that German conditions forced difficult choices. The body I built in America could not survive on what Germany could provide. I gave most of my food to my children. I survived on potato skins and whatever grain I could steal. It might have been easier to have known nothing but hunger than to experience abundance and then lose it abruptly. But nourishment in the camps had not been limited to food. American POW installations mounted sweeping educational initiatives that would influence the reconstruction of post-war Germany. More than 50,000 prisoners enrolled in courses that covered topics as varied as agricultural science, philosophy, engineering, literature, and mathematics. Camp Concordia, for instance, offered nearly 300 subjects, frequently taught by faculty from regional colleges. The curriculum intentionally included material barred under the Nazi regime: democratic theory, market economics, constitutional principles, and the intellectual foundations of liberal governance. Prisoners read the Federalist Papers, Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill. They held structured debates on political authority, economic policy, and the nature of civil society. The intellectual revitalization mirrored the physical rehabilitation many experienced, strengthening minds alongside bodies. Camp newspapers also underwent a quiet revolution. Publications that initially served as vehicles for Nazi messaging gradually transformed into open forums where prisoners discussed Germany's political future. The largest of these papers, Die Ruf, meaning the call, eventually reached an audience of about 25,000 prisoners. Its pages shifted from ideological rigidity to spirited examinations of democracy, post-war reconstruction, and social responsibility, an evolution that reflected the broader ideological journey of its contributors and readers.
Academic life flourished even in smaller installations. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, who taught physics while interned at Camp Shelby, remarked that the facilities available to prisoners exceeded those at many German universities. Quote, "We had proper laboratories, adequate textbooks, and genuine intellectual freedom," he wrote. Jewish scholars who had escaped Germany taught beside us without bitterness. The willingness to share knowledge with former enemies, von Braun observed, demonstrated a confidence in American institutions that proved more persuasive than any propaganda campaign. The Special Projects Division, which oversaw covert re-education efforts, found its greatest successes in voluntary participation and lived example rather than coercive instruction. By 1945, roughly 25,000 German POWs had enrolled of their own accord in courses on democratic governance. They studied documents banned in the Reich, debated ideas that had once been grounds for arrest, and witnessed the practice of free expression firsthand. Within the camps, newspapers criticized American policies, racial issues were discussed openly, and disagreements were aired without fear. Experiences unimaginable under totalitarian rule. For many prisoners, the material prosperity they enjoyed in captivity appeared as tangible proof that democracy could deliver stability and abundance. Former Wehrmacht officers who had pledged allegiance to Hitler often found their assumptions quietly crumbling. Colonel Hans von Luck, a veteran of the campaigns in Poland, France, and North Africa, later wrote, quote, "We arrived utterly convinced of the righteousness of the Nazi cause. What we encountered forced us to reconsider everything we had believed." Many German prisoners later remarked that they did not come to admire American democracy through coercion, but through a daily accumulation of experiences. What changed their minds was not propaganda, they insisted, but the contrast between their own wartime deprivation and the relative abundance they encountered in captivity. As one former POW put it years later, quote, "Our belts had to be loosened, not tightened. That alone told us their system functioned. Ours simply had not." Roughly 5,000 former prisoners eventually chose to return to the United States as immigrants, becoming citizens of the same country that had once confined them behind barbed wire. Thousands more, though they stayed in Europe, kept up correspondence with American families for decades, building long-distance friendships that had begun under extraordinary conditions. These relationships often astonished observers who had assumed that enmity would last long after the war's end. The path toward immigration was rarely straightforward. In Germany, men who expressed appreciation for their treatment in America were sometimes regarded with mistrust, as if kindness received in captivity had turned them into political sympathizers. In the United States, they faced the opposite suspicion. Former enemies, even if harmless, were not always welcomed warmly. Yet many persevered. Their memories of opportunity, stability, and food in abundance outweighed the obstacles.
Former prisoners scattered across the country, pursuing new lives. Hans V., for instance, established a medical practice in Maine, while Georg Gartner famously lived incognito under an assumed identity for 4 decades before his past caught up with him.
Romantic attachments also played an important role in these post-war transformations. Regulations formally prohibited fraternization, but relationships still developed, first through letters, later through farm work details and community interactions. More than 1,000 former German POWs eventually married American women, forming families that stood as tangible symbols of reconciliation. These couples demonstrated that shared life could triumph over the hostilities that had once divided their nations. A striking demonstration of these bonds occurred at a 1985 gathering in Austin, Texas, where some 500 former prisoners returned, many accompanied by their children and grandchildren, all American-born. One of the returning men delivered the keynote address, recalling the paradox of their wartime experience. "We arrived hungry and defeated, yet left heavier and strangely optimistic. Every additional pound was proof of a system that produced more than enough. Every meal showed us what prosperity under democracy really meant." Economists studying the POW program noted that it created benefits that were remarkable for a wartime policy. Although the federal government spent hundreds of millions on housing, feeding, and managing the prisoners, their labor in agriculture and industry returned nearly the same value, essentially balancing the books. More significantly, officials believe the program strengthened the moral and strategic position of the United States. Well-fed, well-treated prisoners became living demonstrations of American capability and confidence. The program also advanced broader wartime goals. Humane treatment helped protect American prisoners held in Germany. German authorities, aware of U.S. compliance with Geneva rules, extended comparatively better conditions to Americans, especially in contrast with the brutal treatment of Soviet captives. At home, POW labor eased critical manpower shortages, ensuring that harvests were brought in and food reached both the civilian market and Allied supply chains. The longer-term effects extended far beyond the immediate necessities of wartime production. Post-war studies showed that former POWs carried American agricultural methods back to Germany, increasing crop yields by nearly a third within half a decade. Others introduced management strategies and organizational practices they had observed on American farms, in factories, or even in camp operations. Contributions that played a small but real role in the Wirtschaftswunder, West Germany's remarkable post-war economic revival. Many former prisoners became leaders in post-war German reconstruction, and their experiences made them more inclined to cooperate with the United States rather than drift towards Soviet influence. Colonel James Patterson summarized this logic in a 1947 report. "We exchanged surplus food for future stability." He argued that the impressive collective weight gain recorded across POW camps, measured in millions of pounds, amounted to an investment in long-term political goodwill that paid strategic dividends throughout the unfolding Cold War. Few wartime paradoxes were as striking as the physical transformation of the prisoners. As Germany descended into hunger and hardship, men held in American camps added dozens of pounds. In Europe, their families stood in lines for rationed vegetables. Yet in the United States, they encountered menus with actual choices. While their former comrades on the Eastern Front struggled for survival, they attended motion pictures, played organized sports, and received regular medical care. For many, the contrast bordered on the surreal. They survived the war not in spite of captivity, but because of it. These realities highlighted a deeper lesson. The United States could afford leniency even in the midst of total war. Abundance itself became a form of power. The agricultural and industrial might that nourished American soldiers also sustained their prisoners. One German reported gaining more than 50 pounds during his time in the camps, a figure echoed by thousands of others. Each increase on the scale was, in its own way, a testament to the country's productive capacity. In the end, the United States' most effective instrument was not limited to its armed forces or its arsenals. It was the demonstration, quiet but unmistakable, that a free society could generate plenty, even while fighting for its survival. If America had the means to feed its enemies, then its allies, its citizens, and its future partners could trust in its strength. The German prisoners who returned home heavier than they arrived carried with them a powerful message. The real adversary had not been the nation that fed them, but the ideology that had urged them into a war they could never hope to win. Their added weight became symbolic. Each meal chipped away at authoritarian myths. Each day of nourishment hinted at a different kind of society. They went back to Germany changed not only in body but in outlook, bearing memories of a generosity they had once been taught to hate. In that sense, their transformation marked not just personal survival, but the quiet beginning of reconciliation between former foes.